of human rights really arose in society after World War II. And I thought I might mention to you that I'm not just speaking academically in theory. I do understand what phobias are about, because I can tell you that during World War II, every single member of my mother's family was murdered, and all her friends. Not one person was left alive. I understand the meaning of phobias, of people who have so much hatred that they go to that extreme. In my father's case, probably only 3 relatives out of about 200 were left alive, and his first wife and 2 daughters were also murdered. So human rights arose out of this imperative to change the world. And Helen Watchers is the head of the ACT Human Rights Commission, whose vocation really it is to help change this society here in the ACT. Helen.
Thanks so much, Harry and Mohammed, for inviting me here tonight. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight. I respect their continuing culture, the oldest in the world, at between 65 to 80,000 years, and pay my respect to elders past, present and future. Raymond Gaita, one of Australia's most esteemed moral philosophers, speaks of the rise of racism in the world as something to do with increasing dehumanising, a failure to see the full humanity of other people. And I think that is at the heart of Islamophobia and what we need to be aiming at. At the Human Rights Commission, we have 4 commissioners, and our work is to protect the humanity and inherent dignity of all human beings, because human rights belong to people by virtue of being human. They're universal, inalienable and indivisible. We have 5 main functions. We deal with complaints, relevantly discrimination and vilification complaints on the basis of race or religion. We do human rights education in the community. We advise the government and others and intervene in court cases. And we do systemic reviews, oversight and audit powers in big systems, things like the correctional system. We go inside the Alexander McConaughey Centre in Bunbury. And lastly, individual advocacy for victims of crime and people experiencing vulnerability. Children, people with disability, older people and people suffering from mental health issues. I think a couple of definitions would be useful. Prejudice is an unfavourable opinion, feeling or judgment formed before you've met somebody and without knowledge, thought or reason. Stigma is an attribute that is seen as an undesirable difference. It significantly discredits or reduces the social standing of a person. And Islamophobia, as you would have guessed, is the irrational fear of Islam. Irrationalism, I think, is at the heart of it. Canberra, in my view, is a generally compassionate, tolerant and inclusive community. I mean, that's not 100%. Mike talked about minorities, and there are. There have been reported instances of Islamophobia in the ACT. Some are more high profile, some are complaints that have come to us and you would never have heard about them unless they end up in the courts. One high profile incident, and it was covered by the Canberra Times, was in 2012. An American corporation called Chick issued some cartoon pamphlets all around Canberra, and it had vilifying depictions of people of Islamic and a Catholic faith. You all, of course, know about the protracted legal battle by concerned citizens of Canberra about the new mosque in Gungahlin that has been overcome by the community, which I'm very proud to have supported. And even in 2014, the Canberra Islamic Centre in Monash was vandalised. And I think that the best thing about that was it actually brought the whole community, the whole Islamic community and the whole community who came to help repair the damage, because that doesn't reflect who we are. This community is actually better than that. Some recent cases that have come to the Commission, a young man claimed at the workplace he left because someone at work had called him and other Muslims terrorists and made derogatory remarks. Another young Muslim woman was asked to leave a club or wasn't allowed entry because she had a headscarf. It was a condition of entry, which is illegal. And a third case is a woman who went to a doctor for a consultation, and he, during the consultation, said he disliked Muslim people and Islam, and he thought Donald Trump was fantastic and you shouldn't be allowed to travel in the West, which is also illegal behaviour for someone who's providing that kind of service. And I pay tribute to people who actually come to us with a complaint because we can actually do something about it. We can get an apology, we can get a reversal in policy, we can get that person disciplined. In the case of a doctor, it could go to the health regulator to actually do something about that. And just in last month, there was a case of Bottrell and Sunil about someone being vilified on a website and in social media, and it went through the commission and to the tribunal, and there was a finding in their favour that meant that anything anti that person's religion had to be taken down from social media and their website. So that was a victory. It was something that happened against an ACT resident by someone in New South Wales, but we got over the being different jurisdictions problem quite easily. Human rights commissions have a very important role to nurture an inclusive and accepting society, but there's two ways you do that. You have to have, when things go wrong, you need a recourse, somewhere to go to fix what the problem is. But that enough is not enough alone. You really need to proactively promote an inclusive culture. And I think we have a proud human rights culture here in the ACT. We've got a high level of education. There's no actual excuse for ignorance or intolerance about different faiths and different races. But we can't be complacent, and strength and diversity has to be affirmed and celebrated through vigilance. We did this with a campaign, and you'll see on your tables there are postcards of Bianca Elmire and Francis Owusu. It was called Diversity Goes With Our Territory campaign. We launched it on International Day of Tolerance, and the history behind it was we had 5 annual community race relations roundtables where we listened to the community and consulted, and they said, we want this kind of campaign that shows the strengths of people in our community and what we've got in common. And so we picked a dozen people from different religious and racial backgrounds. We told their stories with videos, and Muhammad Ali was one of those champions, and Nick Manicus here tonight. And I think it's been quite a good tool to help end racism and prejudice. There's been a much bigger campaign at the national level called Racism Stops With Me, and that's led by the Australian Human Rights Commission in Sydney, and there's been a lot of resources thrown at that. This is a much more grassroots, small campaign, and I'd really like to relaunch it and refresh it now that the Commission's been reformed and merged with the Victims of Crime Commission and the Public Advocate. I think it's really important for people to know, as bystanders, you can actually do something to stop racism. Even if it's not directed at you, you can stand by the person who it's being directed at if you don't have the confidence to actually take on the person who's being racist or making Islamophobic remarks. And there's a group called I'll Ride With You. It's where you'll sit next to somebody in public transport where, especially in Sydney, people have not been feeling comfortable about that. And I think it actually may have originated in London or New York, but it's here in Australia if that's something you would like to do. I know there's been incidents at Monica, Diana Abdul Rahman told me of a case, and actually a young boy stood up to the bully and had an effective remedy on the spot. They didn't have to come to the admission. If you can confront a bully with irrational, ignorant views, I think that's the best remedy in your own hands. But we do have legal recourse in the ACT. There are 2 forms. We've got a Human Rights Act, the first in Australia. Victoria has followed, and Queensland has announced that it's also going to have one. And it has a legislative basis for equality and freedom of religion and other cultures' rights. It's a very clear message about having shared values and moral standards that our society aspires to protect and uphold. And they come from the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights that emanated from the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights that the UN promulgated after the end of World War II. We do have one economic, social and cultural right, that is the right to education, which includes the rights of parents to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their convictions, and we're the first jurisdiction to do that. The UK similarly has that. Public authorities, that's ministers, directorates, policing, corrections, any kind of public servant, must act compatibly with human rights and give proper consideration when making decisions. If you're a victim of a human rights violation, you have to go to the Supreme Court to get damages, or you can go to another court and argue human rights in that case. I'd actually prefer a more accessible and practical forum that you could be able to come to the Commission with a complaint, similar to what happens under the Discrimination Act. Discrimination Act is quite old now, it's 1991. It applies to areas of public life such as education, employment, accommodation and provisions of goods and services like medical services. It prohibits direct and indirect discrimination based on the protected attributes. There's nearly 30 now, but definitely we've got race and religious conviction. We also have racial vilification, and since nearly 2 years ago we've had protection against religious vilification. There's also serious vilification is an actual criminal offence. If there's intentional or reckless threats of physical harm, then you can actually go to the police about that, and the Commission will refer that on, and the person will suffer more serious consequences than civil vilification or discrimination. There's been a lot of debate about these issues. It's actually taken a decade for this law reform to happen. Back in 2006, we published an issues paper on racial and religious vilification. That was followed up in 2010. Virginia House just started a national debate about banning the burqa. And as I said before, Chick Literature had this awful cartoons that was anti-Muslim in 2012. So we recommended actually that we have a racial and religious tolerance protection, such as Victoria. And that happened in 2016. The former Attorney General, Simon Corbell, actually had a bill in 2012, but it lapsed with the election in that year. But there was a general review of the Discrimination Act in 2014, and the government enacted disability vilification, and the Greens had an amendment that meant that we now have religious vilification. So it is against the law to vilify someone because of their religion. And the definition of vilification is inciting hatred towards, revulsion of, serious contempt for or severe ridicule of a person or group of persons on the grounds of protected attributes such as race and religion. So if you make a complaint to the Commission, we'll conciliate that case. If you reach an agreement, that agreement is lodged with the ACT Civil and Administrative Tribunal and has the force of an order of a tribunal without the stress or expense of actually going through a formal legal hearing. If we can't resolve the case, then you have the right to go to the tribunal. And the kind of remedies the tribunal can give, the Commission can also give, such as an apology or compensation to get your job back, that kind of thing. In conclusion, Raymond Gaita talked about the needs for human rights to be embedded and draw upon the richer vocabulary about what's ethically necessary for us to assist people to see our common humanity, to create a community of nations. I think it's actually dialogue. In a democracy, of course, there's going to be differences that need to be resolved, but dialogue is a way to exchange ideas in a civil way based on fact and reason, not on ignorance and prejudice and Islamophobia. I think conversations like we're having tonight are really important, and positive campaigns like Diversity Goes With Our Territory and the National Racism That Stops With Me is how we prevent this occurring. And if it does occur, I would encourage you to come to the Commission and find out what your rights are, help tell other people what their rights are, and do something about it. Be empowered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. There are three important things one can add to a set of rules for society, and Helen's mentioned them. Number one, don't be a perpetrator who discriminates against others. Don't be a victim. You have a right to move freely in this society, not to be insulted or offended, not to be discriminated against. And when you see discrimination or prejudice, don't be a bystander. Because in the ACT, the figure I saw recently, there are only 627 AFP officers. Not very many. One thing I've always had mentioned to me by overseas students whom I've hosted, they just can't believe there's no police. They never see any police on the streets or in cars, hardly ever. I know there's the Embassy Protection Police, but in terms of in general around, they really don't see many. So the important thing is for each of us to take responsibility to report it. Now, Helen has mentioned the offices that the Human Rights Commission offers in Canberra. And our next speaker, Bryce Harnack,